Hi, and welcome to this second day of our Rockwell Foundation Conference Festival on Systems Innovation. We're joining you from Copenhagen, and as we're in Copenhagen, we thought we might start by lighting a candle. And as this conference goes on today, you'll notice that it will get slightly darker outside. My name's Charlie Leadbeater, and I'm very glad to be the host of this discussion and moderator for the week. And I thought we could just begin by setting today's session, which is about how innovation, systems innovation emerges from within systems in the wider context of what we're discussing. So I'm just going to introduce you then over here to some of the frameworks that we introduced in our session yesterday. So we have been working, and we have a green paper in which sets out these frameworks. I don't know if you can see this overhead view from this overhead camera. So we're very grateful to our designer, Sissel, who did these great drawings for us, illustrations, and Jonas, who's operating the camera at the moment. But yesterday we talked about what we call our 3x4 = 12 kind of model. And what that means is we think that often systems innovation involves change across 3 levels: the macro landscape level of norms, demography, the micro level of entrepreneurship and innovation, and the middle level, the meso, which is where the regime of the system often operates. And systems innovation often usually involves change at all these 3 levels coming together. Then we talked about the 4 keys we think operate to unlock systems, which are often stuck together. And those are power, purpose, resources, and relationships. And we talked through how often when systems are very powerful, these 4 things are themselves locked together. And to shift a system, you need to open them up, and you need to create a sort of new kind of configuration between these ingredients. And then we went on at the end, because we're very interested in the practical role that you can play in bringing about systems change, how people can deliberately act to create new systems, to change existing systems. We talked about our 12 roles. 12 is quite a lot. We think there are quite a lot of people involved in systems change, but we focused on a few that were critical: entrepreneurs with visionary system shifting ventures, conveners who bring people together, investors who invest in the future system. But we thought, and we think, that there's one particular group who are really, really important. And that's the group we want to focus on today. So as part of our green paper, we have this model, which we call the washing machine model. And all that this says is that often that there are incumbent systems which are trying to modernize and renew, even if they're under pressure. And they're often entrepreneurs and outsiders with challenging new ideas. And change happens often where they come together. There can also be conflict there. They can also create stasis, but this is where the change takes place, where the existing system that's trying to adapt often meets new and radical ideas, and out of it come new hybrid possibilities. And we think that there's one particular role that's really critical in this, which is often sort of underestimated, really. Often a lot of attention is paid to the entrepreneurs who operate down in this space down here. But we think there's a group of people who operate here or thereabouts, who we call inside outsiders. And the inside outsiders are people who recognize that the existing system needs to change, and they're opening up, if you like, conduits to pull in new ideas and to expose the existing system to new ideas. So with the help of two brilliant speakers and a couple of brilliant respondents today, we're going to explore the life of the insider-outsider, what it's like to try and bring radical change to existing systems. Before we do that, I just want to get a sense of who is in the room with us today, in the Zoom room, from all over the world. We've had more than 1,600 people sign up for sessions this week from 71 countries. So we're just going to introduce you to the first of 2 or 3 polls that we're going to do in the course of the day. You can see it up on the screen. Simple question to begin with: where were you here yesterday? Second, where are you logging in from? What part of the world? Are you working inside a public system or outside a public system? And then finally, do you think radical change is impossible within a public system? You have to work outside to do that, or can radical change happen from inside? So people are voting away on that, and I can see probably about 70% of people have voted. So we'll just give it another 15 seconds to allow people to complete their voting. There's obviously no role for postal voting or mail-in ballots in this election, but we're getting to, I think we've probably hit our limits close, and we'll end the poll there, I think, Anton. So there we have the results. So it's a pretty even split. 42% are new today, 60%, 58% have come back from yesterday. There's a lot of people from Denmark and the rest of Europe, obviously, some from Africa, some from North America, some from the Middle East and Asia. So there's a fair spread. A lot of people, the majority, 2/3, are working outside public systems, and 1/3 are working inside. But here's the thing, actually, an overwhelming majority think that radical change can happen from inside. So it's completely wrong to write off the public service as being incapable of radical change. Actually, radical change can happen, but it's probably quite difficult to do so. So one of the things we think is really important in the discussion of systems innovation is to not turn it into an antagonistic them and us kind of discussion. Outsiders are great and insiders are sort of slow moving and difficult. So we'll take that away. We've got various ways to interact today. My colleague, Jenny Winhall, is looking after the Q&A button. So if you want to interact, don't use the Q&A, don't use the chat, use the Q&A. Jenny, do you want to just quickly introduce us to the Q&A?
Yes, hi everybody. So I will be doing my very best to track what questions and comments you're posting to the Q&A channel today. So as Charlie says, many of you will be used to using Zoom in a Zoom meeting where you're interacting on the chat. That's not where we're going to interact today. We're going to use the Q&A button, which should be right next to that on the bottom of your screen. And what we'd like you to do, you'll see that our colleague Anton has posted a starter question in the chat, in the Q&A there for you. So in your experience, what is essential to persuade people working in a current system that there is a case for radical change? Is it evidence, examples, incentives, funding, or leadership? If you'd like to put your responses to that, you can answer or comment on that question. You're very welcome to post new questions yourself, and you can upvote questions that you think are important for us to pay attention to. And I will be doing my very best to pick up on some of those and bring them into the conversation. We've also had several of you who have submitted questions before the session started, so we'll also be bringing those questions in today. So we'll be watching the conversation as it goes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. We've also got obviously social media hashtags, which have been shared in the chat if you want to use those and interact on Twitter and other platforms. And the other thing that we've got going at the moment is we've got a graphical recorder called Riley, who's working with us all the way from Mexico City. And so you'll be able to dip in to see what Riley is doing with her board there and how that develops. And at the end of the session, when she's finished, we'll create a digital copy of that and send it to you tomorrow, along with some other stuff to follow up on the session. It's worth saying as well that we'll have a device called a Padlet open. And a Padlet is a sort of bulletin, very simple bulletin board, in which you can post reflections. And that's important because often I find, anyway, I have my best ideas about a conference about 45 minutes after it's finished, when I'm on the way home or something like that. So the Padlet will be a way for you to check in with that. And of course, we're recording today's session so that you can be able to watch it back and see what was discussed if you want more detail. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our two main panelists and contributors, Sophie Humphreys, the founder of Pause, and Whatever It Takes from the UK, and Alex Fox, who's Chief Executive of Shared Lives Plus, which represents shared life schemes in the UK. So Alex, Sophie, welcome. Great to have you here. So sad that you can't actually be in Copenhagen, but we'll have to correct that in due course. Sophie, can I start with you? And I'm going to ask you both this question. Can you just briefly describe your work at Pause and crucially how it differs from the current system with which you're interacting and which the people you work with are interacting? What's different about Pause?
Hi, thank you, Charlie, and lovely to be here today. And yeah, sad not to be in person, but very excited to be with so many people from so many different places. So briefly about Pause. I mean, Pause came from, I was working as a social worker. I was running the Child Protection Services in Hackney, a busy London local authority, second on the deprivation scale in the country. So clearly a lot of need and poverty. And I think what Pause came about was seeing cycles that people are stuck, caught in, very entrenched, often transgenerational, that were causing great harm for them, but also causing great harm to others, and how the system was responding to it, unfortunately, was not working. Pause is about, it works with women who've had children removed and who are at risk of having repeated children removed, and aims at breaking that cycle for good, to improve the lives of those women, but ultimately to stop children going into care and to improve the lives of those children and their relationships. Pause is a very focused, very intense model. It's very much predicated on the relationship between a skilled practitioner going alongside the participant and having the opportunity to develop that relationship in the context of time, flexibility, bespoke, and an ability to persist, and also to work in a way that they are able to use their practice. Those practitioners are leading. This is not a system or a manualized approach. This is about trusting the people who know what they do best, and to be able to work and for them to make that relationship develop and work. What's different? I think the way it's different is a lot of people talk about relational models, and you can say it, but saying it doesn't make it happen. And I think that's key. For things to happen, things have to be different. And one of the things we're looking at Pause, what was clear was that these women that we were working with had been defined by their issues. These women, I just used the term myself just then, rather than seeing them as individuals and who are multifaceted. And they're not defined by those issues. That's one part of them. Being a mother is one part of us. and actually recognizing we had to focus on other elements. So I think one of the things was the starting point, not starting with the problems. All our systems, our governments, our government departments, certainly in this country, in England, are focused around the problems. That's where we start. That's how we define people. So it was looking at, let's start at aspiration, and actually through aspiration, through hope, and through identifying that, eliciting that, that takes a lot of work. That's through that hook, what will enable somebody to engage with us at a different level and recognize they have a right to aspire as much as everybody else, irrespective of the number of compounding problems. And through that, there are three crucial elements that number one is that relationship. Number two is those breaking cycle ingredients, which I can expand on more if you like, but that's certainly it's there on the sort of information. And three is context. Context is everything. That if you put those 1 and 2 into a certain context, you will make, excuse the analogy, but you will bake a good cake. And I believe that's through support and actually protecting that relationship in a way, like in a bubble. I know we're talking about bubbles rather a lot at the moment, but before the pandemic, I think we talked about bubbles, meaning something that was protected, able to work and do the job it's there to do, and enable it to move along in the system, impacting on everything it touches, from the individual, their system, and then thinking about the wider system and how it responds, and to influence, to model, to show and not tell, about getting out there and doing it and showing people how to do it differently.
So it's very much about practice, and it's very much about shifting from serving a problem that you identify to unlocking aspiration and capability through a relationship, but doing that in a very structured kind of way with skilled practitioners who really know what they're doing. Just briefly before I move on to Alex, you've recently got some updated evaluation of pause, which is not just which has longitudinal data about the impact of the women. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so yeah, very excited this week. It's just been published now by the Department for Education in England, and what's added, the initial valuation we had very much showed the impact, the effect, the reduction in children going in care, and also the impact for those women during the programme. What we're now seeing is the impact that's accumulative over time. In a way, the work with pause, that the women who are there for working with us alongside together for 18 months, is that in a way it's about foundations. What it's proving is that by helping shore up those foundations that they are able to build their lives on, is actually a lot of the growth goes on and they develop from that. It's not so much what we do and what we do together, but it's about that solid base, and that's now become very evident. But I think the thing that's very striking, and pause will, by the end of this year, is due to be in approximately 40 local authorities, which is nearly a third of local authorities in England. What is really clear is they've now got a very strong evidence of a counterfactual that shows the impact of areas that have a pause practice in it, or those areas that don't, and actually a very clear graph that shows that the number of children going into care continues to rise in those areas that don't have a pause, and it starts to go down in those other areas. But also what it's showing now is the wider impact on the system. So on the general services like social care, like housing, and how that modelling model, that showing, not telling, is beginning to develop and help people think about different ways, different starting points in different places. So that's you know,
that's almost as close to a randomized controlled trial as you could get without it being an RCT, that comparison. So Alex, can come over to you. Tell us a little bit about Shared Lives as an idea and a program, a movement, really, I suppose, in many ways, and what's different about it. And in particular, you have spread, as well as Sophie. How do you scale and spread something without it becoming a creature of the system? without it becoming captured? How do you hold true to the different idea at the heart of the programme?
Thanks, Charlie. Well, I loved what Sophie said about showing and not telling. And so I think I'll start by just telling you a story about somebody who's used Shared Lives, who's Meg, one of our ambassadors, who works with us now. And Meg lived for a number of years in the mental health system, in the most medical bit of that system on hospital wards. And when she became medically well enough to leave that system, she didn't have anywhere to go. She didn't have a community to return to. So for Meg, Shared Lives was a way, not exactly back into the community, but actually to build her community. Because for all of us, our community is our relationships with other people. It's not a place you can go to. So Meg was matched with one of the UK's 10,000 shared life carers. It's called Hayley, and she moved in with Hayley, lived with her for over a year. So she got the home that she needed in an ordinary house. She got the practical and emotional support as she was recovering from mental illness. But also Meg talks about it very much as in terms of going on adventures, making friends, getting work, finding meaningful things to do, building up all of those connections and relationships, which all of us need for a good life. And so that sort of gets across, I think, Shared Lives as a model of care which doesn't sit within the medical system, although it is a regulated social care service. So Hayley and other shared life carers are trained, they're paid, they work under contract, but they do something deeply personal through welcoming somebody into their home, whether that's an older person with dementia who comes to visit regularly rather than going to a day centre, or somebody with a learning disability or a mental health problem or another support need who comes and lives with you, when both of you feel like it's a good match. So Shared Lives feels quite different to other forms of support, long-term support for adults that we offer in the UK for a couple of reasons. I think one is the way that people are recruited into the Shared Lives carer role, which is a process that takes weeks or more typically months, a really deep getting to know that person, because they and their household, whoever lives with them, is going to have to be really committed to what's not just a job, it's a lifestyle change. And then secondly, this idea of matching. When I worked years ago as a care assistant in residential care homes with people with learning disabilities, I remember being taught all about boundaries, about being dispassionate, being detached, not having favourites. And actually Shared Life says, well, no, if we want people to have these deep, long-lasting relationships, and I meet people who've lived together now for 40 years, they need actually to be able to choose each other, not just can I help you, but also are we a good fit? And one of the things that Meg was saying in a session we were in the other day was that she feels like she's not just a case file on somebody's shelf. She's a person, and it's the value that she adds to the lives of those around her, which has been as much a route to wellness as the support that she's received. So, sorry, go on, Charlie. Now, I was going to say, part of it, there's something about relationships and about a very different kind of relationship. And we're obsessed in the UK with reforming organisations and structures and systems. And what we never really stop and think about is what is the core support relationship that we want people who offer help and people who receive help to have between each other. And we've got an idea about that support relationship, which is stuck in the past, when it might have been okay to have much briefer, more transactional relationships, because we didn't have quite as many people who are going through decades-long complex support journeys. But actually what we really need is these different, deeper relationships.
So in a way, both of you have at the core of your offer a sort of signature relationship, practitioner and participant in pause, and, kind of host and family member in Shared Lives Plus. And what's striking about the descriptions you've both given is that in order for this to work, it has to work for both sides. It's not just for one side. So in Sophie's case, the practitioner gets to be a practitioner. They're trusted, they use their judgment, there's autonomy and discretion there. And in the Shared Lives case, you can see the value presumably going both ways. I mean, so could you just both briefly describe then the kind of tenor of your relationship with these big systems around, which sit around you, because you're definitely critical of them, and you're, in some sense, and you're definitely doing something different. But I sense your relationship with them is not antagonistic. In fact, in a way, you're trying to coax them into seeing the world in a different kind of way. Sophie, first you, and then Alex.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting hearing Alex talks, also watching his video you had online. And although very different, and we talked yesterday as well about very different on one level, the work we do, because obviously something like Pause and Whatever It Takes is very intense. Intense, and I'm not saying that intense as in working with people who are caught at the sort of worst end point of their lives, which what I notice is a discussion around boundaries and around when you're working within a local authority. When I first was setting up Pause, I was running that service, the child protection service in Hackney. So actually, I very much was your insider, and did feel like I was in a washing machine as well. When you talked about the washing machine, it was. But what was really interesting is that from being inside, it meant I absolutely wasn't antagonistic, but could really feel and understand the sort of the system that people were caught in, and the need actually to free people and free professionals, and for all of to actually recognise that you can do that within as well. You don't have to go off and be a separate entity to do that. And I think it's very much that relationship-based work that we're talking about in how we work with participants. It's as much about how we work together. And it's not believing, it's recognising it everybody, whether it's in statutory services or whether it's in sort of more, third sectors we would call here, but certainly, charity sector, is that everybody has probably started doing what they're doing because they cared and because they want to relate to people. And I think believing that is that what sits at the heart of it means that you try and connect, and that whole concept around the hook is trying to find what is it that will help you relate with that person on that level. And actually, I think there's so much fear about relationships. I think the systems we construct are all about protecting people from feeling on a professional level. Having been a social worker, and I'm sure, see Alex nodding, I suspect in the same sort of care worker profession, is that actually it's dangerous to relate because you're crossing these boundaries. If you start feeling, then you're going to find it very difficult when you're asked to kind of withdraw and all of those things. So we make a system that's very bureaucratic to stop that. I believe it's purposeful. So I think it's helping people going alongside professionals in those organisations, in those statutory agencies, to show that feeling and caring is not crossing boundaries in an unhealthy way. Actually, through caring, we're going to have more impact. Through caring, we're going to feel better and more satisfied. And actually, as in shared lives, it's about a reciprocal relationship. So it should be in any of these professions, whether it's a social worker who's working with 30 families, it's got to be something you go home and you feel satisfied, and that you feel that you enjoy that time with people, even if sometimes it's in very difficult circumstances. I've removed children from people and still had a relationship with the people that we've had to remove those children from. So I think there are lots of ways one can do that.
Let Alex, how you've been very critical in many ways of the traditional care system, and yet you're also trying to find ways to work with it and encourage it to change.
Yes, and I think so. One of the questions I always like to ask is there such a thing as a system? Because we all believe it's out there, but I've never found it. And if you talk to people at the front line, or if you talk to government ministers, they'll always tell you that the power lies elsewhere, and that there are things they wish they changed and they couldn't. And we often tend to celebrate people who just refuse to behave in the way that the system demands of them. And as Sophie says, that's a huge risk. And yet we found out this year, particularly as people who during the crisis have just said, well, we can't do things like we normally do, and have done things very differently, often with much less process, and the sky in that sense hasn't fallen in. So we do sit both within and without the system. I think my predecessors carved out enough space within the regulatory system for shared lives to exist. And it was really important that we weren't outside of it. So we're a regulated model. The government's care inspectors, the Care Quality Commission, consistently say that we're the highest performing form of social care, rather than say the riskiest. You know, the risks are there, but they're well managed. So if we were outside of that system entirely, we wouldn't be able to get the referrals, we wouldn't be able to get the funding. But if we were too far within that system, or if that space that's been carved out for those shared lives relationships closed in, then we'd lose the humanity and those different kinds of relationships. So it's a constant tension, I think.
Brilliant. Yeah. I mean, in a way, what you're describing is how shared lives has sort of created a sort of bit of an enclave for itself within the system where it can develop and grow. And Sophie talked about creating this bubble where you can sort of develop and grow things. And the system's there and you're interacting with it. It's evaluating you, regulating you. I'm just going to bring in a couple of questions that we had earlier, just so that you know they're there, so that when we come to the discussion later, you can answer them. So we've had a question, Sophie, for you, which is basically, when you're pitching pause to a local authority, what is it that's the most convincing argument to a local authority to adopt it? Is it cost benefit analysis? Is it evidence of impact? Is it the credibility of practitioners talking on behalf of it? And Alex, for you, we've had a question from someone who sounds like they're sort of having a mea culpa, who you once pitched to for investment, and who said when you came to them, it was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, and they're wondering how they could have done a better job and what advice you'd give to funders who want to fund system innovation or more radical ideas like this, but don't quite know how to. So we'll come back to those questions. We're just going to quickly now go to another poll to see what people have been making of this. So if we bring up that poll, Anton, the second poll, here we are. Voting is open. So the first question is really about what is it that would have the biggest impact to make innovation easier from within the system. And the second is, what are the most important ingredients for scaling a radically different approach? And I think you can vote freely now. We'll let that go for a little bit. And meanwhile, just bear in mind that we have these other channels. We have the Q&A channel. So if you want to log a question, do it there. We have a thing called a Padlet, a bulletin board, which you'll find a link to in the chat, and you can post your reflections there. And for those who want longer, more in-depth explanations from Sophie and Alex of the work that they do and how they do it, we've got 2 recorded interviews that we did before the conference. They're about 25 minutes, which go into considerable depth about their models and how they work. So you can dip back into those afterwards if you should want to. So you've got about 20 seconds to vote. So if you get your votes in, I can see they're still coming in fairly quickly. We've got about 2/3 now. Obviously, private sector outsourcing is not regarded as a major way to make innovation from within a system easier. And just scrolling down, we've got a fair mix of other things. So I think we've got 10 seconds to register your vote, and then we'll close the poll, Anton. So if you haven't voted, this is your final chance, and there we have it. So these are the results. So actually, what would make the biggest impact to make systems innovation easier? There's quite a lot of support, importance of political support. Politicians are often the missing parties to these discussions. The user engagement is important, but overwhelmingly there's a sort of desire to combine insiders and outsiders, that the creative combination of insiders and outsiders is very important. That raises the very important question of, well, who convenes that? How is it made possible? And then as far as the most important ingredients are concerned, changing working practices and evidence of impact are important, but leadership is absolutely critical. So thank you for that. We've got the Q&A open, and I think we've got another question on the Q&A, which is really about whether we need more people to think of themselves as systems innovators or not. And so there's been quite a lot in all of that. We're just going to give you a minute, roughly speaking, to reflect on that. And we're going to show you quickly how Riley, our graphic responder, our graphic recorder, is getting on with her drawing from Mexico City. And there it is. You can see it unfolding in action.
Lovely.
Any comments? Deeper and different, or different and deeper, within and without, feeling and caring, showing, not telling. There's something very important here about structured relationships, which is about creating relationships within a structure which enables professionalism and manages risk. So we'll come back to Riley later in the conversation. But now I want to bring in two brilliant first responders who are going to give us some thoughts about what they've heard, and to reflect on that and their own considerable experience in the field. And we're joined by Ree Perry, who is Chief Executive of the Municipal Council of Næstved. Now, if you're Danish and on the call and you haven't recognized what I've said, here's proof of that's where Ree is from, and I apologize if my Danish has failed me completely. And Vita Maiorano from Taxi in Adelaide. And Vita works for the Australian Centre for Social Innovation in Adelaide, and is up well past midnight to be with us. And Vita's played a critical role in developing and scaling and spreading innovations from Taxi, including a fantastic program called Family by Family. So Vita, because you're most at risk of actually keeling over and falling asleep, I'm going to come to you and just ask you for one reflection and one question that's come to your mind listening to Alex and Sophie.
Yeah, and the reflection is what cuts across a lot of the work that I've seen that we do here in Australia is around the importance of relationship and how that has to cut across the whole system of support. So relationship with families, with people who need some care, and carers as well, what that all means, but also the relationship for all the systems that sit around that. And how, you know, in the interviews, because I've watched both your interviews, Sophie and Alex, I was really excited about delving deeper into your experience. Those relationships need a change in culture so that we don't get a system snapback. Because, you know, whilst you're in the system, you can be part of the system, but also be considered to be quite different to the system. And so how those relationships can create that support is really key. So your experiences on how that emerging culture actually gets fostered and grown in a different way. So it starts, you know, I talk in metaphors, so it actually builds roots into the system, and, you know, you've got actually a new system flourishing around you.
You're on mute, Charlie.
How does it sound? Thank you, Alex. That's a basic error which I should now be capable of not making. Ree, how does it sound?
Oh, it sounds really interesting. First of all, thank you for two very inspirational presentations from both Sophie and Alex. Well, I'm the CEO of a big municipality. I've got around 7,000 employees, and it's like across elderly care, child protection, schooling, daycare. And in Næstved, we're working on trying to implement a different view upon working with our citizens. I would say maybe we are trying to adopt Sophie's. I think Sophie's calling it working alongside, and we're sort of trying to adopt that in our way of working with our citizens. But what I've learned and what I'm reflecting upon, especially about Sophie's presentation, was it's a very focused, intense model. It's sort of working with a specific area, trying to change it with a specific view. And I'm starting to reflect upon whether we are too ambitious in our own goals in my municipality, because we're sort of trying to work it on a very large scale with all our services at once. And it's really, I'm finding that a lot of my employees and practitioners are sort of reluctant to step outside the known areas and the sort of safe environment of working within a certain legislation. Or for example, we've got a project in Næstved that's called Families Forward, that's sort of trying to work with very complex issues with families with a lot of issues like drug abuse, like unemployment, like child protection issues, like a lot of different kind of issues. And it's a very sort of complex way of working with the families. And the employees working within these projects are finding obstacles in legislation. They're finding obstacles in sort of different practices contradicting making a sort of result with the families. And I'm kind of reflecting upon whether we're being too ambitious on starting on very complex areas. Maybe we should be more focused in our model of changing. And I would like you to reflect upon whether it's sort of too much to scale large, or go large scaling in a full organization, or whether it's better to sort of have little bubbles we're working within to make this innovation happen.
That's a really good question. So there are two really good questions there. So one is really, how do you give it roots and embed it in a real culture, not just a manual or a kind of protocol? I mean, that it's a real sort of living, growing thing. And the second, if I suppose my paraphrase of your question really is how do you find that leverage point where you've only got limited resources? Can you focus on something that then has a real impact? So Sophie, let me come to you first. What's your thoughts on those two questions?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there that really interests me, and I could talk for ages about. So give me a kick in whatever way you do online to stop talking if I talk too much, because it really gets me, thinking and interested. I mean, I think that thing around. I think there's a fear around getting alongside, and I think legislation and systems are a way that we all use sometimes to kind of, as I said, protect ourselves. But I think there's something, I sometimes think like a relay race around how there's a way of getting alongside that you start off nearly doing something for people. You recognize it needs to be intense. You are nearly a bit like a parent. You're sort of actually getting someone up. You're making sure, they're at a point where whatever age they are, this is not chronological. This is about, in a way, people where they are at a sort of psychological level and depending on their circumstance, is that getting alongside, but actually slowly your objective is to be slowly passing that baton in that relay race. And you're not just passing it to that individual. And so you're not just expecting your practitioners or the people within your services to be, you're looking for them to pass it into the system. And that system isn't just about professionals, it's about communities, it's about their family, it's about how during that time you nearly infect together, you become a double power of two together who are going to change the context of the world that person lives in. And so you have to have a belief in your potency as a relationship together to bring about that change. And I think it's through that you recognise that you also have the relief, as you know, if we kept all working intensely of everybody all the time, we would be stunk, we'd be overwhelmed. If I had to remain parenting forever, I think I would just drown. And you know, there has to be a point when you let go. But when you let go of that baton, relationships still have value, and you step in again at points. And so it's, how do you create a system that allows for that without these real cliff edges within it? And I think you can do that at scale. I think you can do that when you've got the response. You know, I'm glad I don't have really your responsibility. And I'm, you know, it's very easy to be sitting here sort of thinking about this sort of intellectually, and it'd be much more, you know, difficult on the ground. But I think it is about that starting point. But also the issue around focus. You know, you were saying about, you know, when one's got all these huge systems and all these things you've got to do, it's overwhelming. We all get overwhelmed when we lose focus. And our to-do list is 50 things rather than 3 very focused areas. So I think there's something around actually looking at what we do and really questioning, are we doing things because we feel we should? And actually, or are we really adding any value? I really question in social work half the time whether how much of what we were doing, was it really making any difference to any of those children's lives, to those families' lives? What if we were to really focus within local authorities? It takes being brave, it takes risk, it takes holding your nerve. I think it's really important, this whole concept around holding the nerve. And actually, if we were to think, right, we're going to really unpick this, we're going to really get inside and see what are the things that are really perpetuating these cycles. Because if we focused on them, we spent more of that time in those systems, in those problems, and in those areas that are entrenched. Would that free up other things? And would that naturally unblock the system? So I think, you know, it's a big discussion, but I do think the scope that we should focus, I think, is a key ingredient to everything we do. I don't think it's about creating lots of bubbles. I think the risk is that then if we have lots and lots of different bubbles, in a way we're doing the same thing again. We're operating in sort of silos. But I think there's something about being sort of nearly like a chameleon, an ability to go from that leaf to this place, and how you can move within the system. You can change your shape, you can change how you fit, you can change how you relate, but you don't stop being a chameleon at heart. You don't stop
Sophie,
being a people. Sorry, yeah,
no,
told you I need
brilliant.
a kick.
Let's bring Alex in. Alex,
yes,
are you a chameleon, Alex?
I don't know about that, but what I heard in Ree's question was what I often think of as the paradox of scale, which is that Ree and many people in those positions of power are faced with these huge dehumanized problems in many ways. Thousands of people, millions or billions of kroner, trying to balance budgets and solve these huge issues. And then the things that we intuitively feel work and are valuable are generally things that happen at a very small, very personal scale. Whether that's a small initiative, a community initiative, or an innovation. And I think we get lost between those two extremes. What can we do with these small appealing ideas when we have these big swirling problems? So the way I think of that is we're usually sort of challenged to scale up. You know, we've reached a certain scale where in every area of the UK, it's not 15 people, it's 15,000 people, but it's still a relatively small part of the UK social care and health system. There's an equal challenge to scale down the models that aren't working, that don't feel human anymore.
Yeah.
And that really comes down to questions of power. So when we ask people to take decisions at that macro scale with that huge amount of power, it's almost impossible to pay the time and attention needed to initiatives, particularly those smaller initiatives, which we intuitively feel are the ones which are valuable. So we need to work out how we scale down, and there are some really interesting models that do that. So, you know, if you look at how Shared Lives does that, it does that through adopting something which feels a bit more like a franchise than a big service. So we don't own Shared Lives, we're a membership body. There are 150 local organisations, and in turn they give a lot of space and freedom to those individuals. They're working within a set regulated model, but they have the freedom to make lots of decisions at that individual level, and models like Buurtzorg from the Netherlands and other self-organizing team models attempt to shift where power and decision-making lies to be at a more human level, which then is more able to work with the models that we intuitively like. And for us, that's about forming lots of alliances. So we came to the conclusion that we'd carved out enough space for shared lives to grow to a certain extent. We also support a model called Home Share, which is much bigger across the world than it is in the UK, which also is about matching people into supportive relationships. But we felt that really, in order for municipalities, whole cities or areas to really change, we had to stop thinking about scaling for it really, and innovation. Innovation is really new ideas to me, and there are hundreds of new ideas all the time, but not many of them grow. And scaling is about growing something within the existing system. We've all got to get ambitious about total system change.
Right.
Partly that's about us putting models which may be quite different, like Pause and Shared Lives, together. But there are dozens, if not scores, of those kinds of models out there now which share that value base. If we put them all together, we create more scale. And then the next step is actually setting a different kind of vision for our public services. So I wrote a book suggesting that it wasn't just about growing shared lives, it's about learning from it, learning about those different relationships I talked about earlier, but ultimately wanting a health and care system which, in the phrase I was using, could escape this invisible asylum that we're all in, this idea of the system that's out there that's constraining us, whereas actually it's all about the behavior that we choose, the things we choose to do each day. And that's got to be ambitious.
So there's a very important distinction there that we've been keen to try and keep hold of, which is the difference between scaling and shifting a system and creating a better alternative. And you can scale without doing any of the latter two. Vita, Ree, I'm just going to bring each of you in really quickly because we need to move on to take some questions from our Q&A channel. Quick 30-second reflection, Ree, and then Vita.
Well, I think that there's a lot of perspectives on this. I've got one question. Can I put one question forward though, because it's so interesting, this. So when I listen to you, it's about recruitment. When I listen to you, you're sort of like, your story is you're sort of recruiting the employees, the practitioners that's got the right ethics and the right skills and the right values into your way of working. So looking from my point of view, I'm standing with a lot of our employees, and I've sort of got to change their ethics and values and skills, maybe even, I don't know. Could you give me a couple of reflections on that? Because I'm sort of, that's a bit of a knot to me that I have to loosen up. Great,
let's come back to that. Vita?
For me, I found, thank you both again, and Alex, the challenge of scaling down is actually just equally as challenging. And that's actually a really good lens to hold, I think. And then speaks to, well, how do we shift from old to new? And what does that middle place feel like? And I think that's really what I'm living in. So how do we move through it to create the new, and how do we orchestrate ensuring that we've got the right things around people so that they can truly thrive and create something new. So that really resonated and created a different lens. So I think it's really important. How do you scale down and up at the same way to get that? Thank you.
So Sophie, I'm going to come back to you in a second to answer, or both of you to answer Ree's question, which is, how do you recruit people in? How do you win them over? Do they have to be already won over, and or how do you win over people who are skeptical? So think about your answers to that. And at this point, I'm going to bring in my great colleague, Jenny Winhall, who's been looking at what's been going on in the Q&A channel and is now going to put to you some of the questions that have been coming up from that channel. Jenny, over to you.
Thanks, Charlie. So you've obviously sparked lots of amazing thoughts in all of our participants listening, because there are some really good questions coming through on the Q&A. And so I'm just going to pull through a few threads of those questions together. And we have 2 questions to start you off with. So the first is from Sam Nuesh, who asks, how is it that you deal with opposers to system innovation? So they might be people with vested interests or people who are afraid to lose what they have, jobs, power, money. So how do you deal with that? And Alex, maybe you could take that one. And then we have a second question, which is a little bit related to how is this different when you're working with political-led systems, which is about the role of sponsors. So this is coming from Soren and Catalina, who ask, of course, all of this is about a lot of patience and determination, but what role do you think that sponsors are playing in helping to shift the system, and who are they? Who are the most important people to work with? And Sophie, maybe you could take that one.
Okay.
So Alex, first to you.
So in terms of opposers and actually sponsors, the most difficult people are the people who are probably neither of those. They're people who agree with you, but just don't feel it's within their power to do anything about it. And often they're people who end up taking up quite a lot of your time because they really like what you do, but they're not actually able to prioritize it. So I think that's sort of, in my experience, we don't find that many people who say they hate the idea of shared lives, for instance. People generally like it, but will they take it seriously? That's quite different. But in terms of opposers, I think it is worth a question I'd always ask is, are we going to tackle this from within that person's frame of reference, in which case you start talking about evidence base, cost benefit, research, and all of those, the stuff that you're supposed to have around any kind of innovation? Or are you going to challenge that frame of reference and indeed challenge the power of that person as well, as initiatives like personal budgets and direct payments have done within the UK, where they recognise that money has an equation with power. Why not give the money to the people who are using the services rather than to the people who are running it, and see if you could shift some of that power with, it has to be said, mixed results. So we can make a clear case around that shared lives is lower cost. It's better in terms of outcomes, it's better in terms of quality, and still not necessarily win someone over, because actually the frame of reference needs to change, which comes back to this deeper point of, are we willing to change what we think support services, where it's health, social care, housing, criminal justice, whatever, are all about? And if we're not, we're probably always going to be faffing around the edges rather than really deeply changing things.
Thank you very much, Alex. And Sophie, to the question about sponsors, who is it that you find yourself most leaning on in this work?
In ways, I think the 2 questions have similarities, and I think that the responses for the, as Alex said, I think it is about winning people over, and that's the same. I call it making friends. Everything you do is about making friends, and it's about connecting with people. And I suppose in my model, the breaking cycles talk about the hook. Everybody has a hook, and so, but everybody's is different. And not only is it different for everybody, it's different every day. It's different depending where they are. So when you're thinking about sponsors, obviously if you're thinking about political sponsors, so for Pause, when we first set up, we got funding through an innovation fund, through the Department for Education. So obviously we needed that children's minister in that department. But you also you have sponsors at so many different levels. And now on this new program setting up, our sponsors, I suppose, are philanthropic funders, also government, also looking at the local authorities, because we want them to want it, to take that on. So I think the way around that, and I don't think it's a way around, I think it's about being authentic. I think being authentic is really important. And I'm going to go back to the chameleon. I hope it's not a really boring analogy, but just because you're a chameleon, you're still real, you're authentic. Your ability to change is a skill. There's a lovely book I used to read my kids, and I can't remember the name of it, but about a chameleon that kept changing its colours and got a bit confused about who it was. As an organisation or as a programme, when you innovate, as long as you know who you are at the heart, and we call this in Pause and now whatever it takes, your core message, Be really clear what that is, and that will hold your integrity throughout and your authenticity. But actually, from that point onwards, you have to be able to have different narratives. You have to be able to identify the hook in different audience. And there's nothing wrong in doing that. And it's a skill, and it's really key. And I think we forget we do that on everyday life, whether it's in our interactions with our family. And, you know, I'm a different person with my different friends, but of course I'm still Sophie, I hope. And it's not about being fake or not being real, but it's recognizing that we have to relate in different ways, and we all have that ability to do it. So in a way of challenges around it, I think political is always hard because of they're working often in such short time scales, and often unfortunately related to themselves and their own ambition and their own, so you've got to link with that. So I think that's back to the hook. And to me, that's the key, is you've got to really work hard at all levels to understand what makes that person tick, whether that's as running the chief exec of a municipal, or whether it's somebody, Alex, and his work as a chief exec of of an organisation that's a national place.
Great, Sophie, thank you very much. And this question of being a chameleon and having many relationships, if you like, to the different ways that different people are thinking about things in the system is very relevant. And I can see that somebody has posted in our Q&A a comment that maybe there isn't the system, maybe there are many systems, and so that's part of how we need to think about them in a more plural way. Mm-hmm. But maybe I could bring you in here, because you are also acting as an insider-outsider within your own municipality. And so this question of, what are the specific challenges do you think doing this kind of radical change within a politically led organisation? Who do you find yourself working with? Well,
I would use that picture of the washing machine. That fits very well for my position, I would say. I think the idea of making friends, as Sophie said, is very important at all levels. In a municipality that's political, that you can't do changes unless your political board understands the changes. So my job is very much about making the purpose, discussing the purpose with my politicians, discussing the purpose with my leaders and my employees. So everybody's sort of got a feeling of what's the purpose of change, because change is not good just for change. There has to be a purpose, an understanding of purpose, and the route needs to be clear. Why are we going this way? What do we get? What's going to happen when we go this way? So in a political system, you need some sort of security, and that's difficult in when you do changes, because changes is about taking risks, and most politicians don't like taking risks that much. So it's about balancing the way of sort of having communication about the purpose, where are we going and why are we going there, and then understanding that there has to be a bit of risk, but the risk has to be sort of measurable. And then there's the dialogue with the organization that's sort of trying to make the systems within the system meet, because we've got a political system, we've got an employee system and a leadership system, and all the systems sort of got to interact to make the change happen. And that is really the difficult part.
Thank you, Ree. That was very clear. So it's great to hear you also, in the same way as Sophie did, talking about the fact that if you can hold on to what that purpose is, then it really helps. You can change your activities and your position as long as you hold on to what the core purpose is, and that helps everybody to locate themselves in that new story. So I'll come to one last question before I hand back to Charlie. So there's a bit of discussion going on in the Q&A about a question to both Sophie and Alex as to what extent do you really feel that you're changing the system rather than overlaying a service or a new kind of system onto it? What is it that you're picking up on, or the signals that you're getting that the wider landscape is changing as a result of what you're doing? And related to that, we've got some questions about, is it important to be measuring things in relation to what the current system thinks is important, or do you find yourselves more trying to build new measures for what you're heading towards with that new system vision?
you want me to crack at that first?
Yeah, please, Alex.
So I suppose one of the ways in which we would measure change is the numbers of people using shared lives and home share. Are they growing? And if they're growing, they're as a proportion of the number of people using other kinds of services, then that feels like it's positive. And we've worked with a number of areas now who've set themselves really ambitious goals about doubling or even tripling the proportion of, say, people with learning disabilities who are using shared lives as opposed to other forms of more traditional care. I think the thing that has to go alongside that, though, is this idea of getting the different kinds of values, relationships, and behaviours out there into the whole of the system. So that's where the alliances I've talked about with other models of what we describe as asset-based support that's looking for what people can or could do, not just for their problems or their needs. And those alliances that start to feel like they create some kind of tipping point in an area. And then finally, we produce something called the asset-based area, which is a product of Think Local Act Personal, a big national partnership around changing services. And the asset-based area was just a 10-point plan for areas like REES to try to tackle this systemically. And it starts with telling a different story, and not the people from the top down telling a different story, but actually the area owning a different story about what we're all here to do. And it was based on something called the Wigan Deal that a city called Wigan in the UK had said, actually, we're going to have a different kind of relationship with our citizens. Here's what it looks like. And then the trick, of course, the challenge is to run that through all of the systems and the processes, the things that feel like they are the system that get in the way of that kind of vision. So what you buy, what you measure, what you penalise if it doesn't happen, how you work with communities, and ultimately, in the most difficult bits of all, where power lies, who gets to make decisions. I've seen questions in the Q&A about leadership. We have to challenge who gets to be the leader, and I think if that's the lesson of the equalities movements and movements like Black Lives Matter this year, is actually we're not in a very diverse session here. You know, there is not a diverse group of people making the decisions, and if that continues to be the case, we won't be making decisions for everyone in the community.
Great. Thank you very much indeed to everyone.
Can I add there, Charlie?
Sophie.
So I'm going to interrupt. So I'm just going to very quickly, if you don't mind. So I just wanted to say, just in relation to the thing around duplication and the risk, I just think it's really key that, and in relation to Ree's question earlier as well, when you're running such a huge service, there is something about tidying up and a responsibility that if you're coming in with programs and if work like WIT, Shared Lives, Pause, I think there are 3 things to ensure: that one's not duplicating, that one's infiltrating, so you're becoming and living and getting in within the system, and actually that you're infecting as well. So you're bringing about change in what you do. So it's not about being another thing added. The responsibility is coming in systemically to bring about that change and get alongside with people, and it's doing it together. And you can't separate. And I'm sorry to say, it's back to that chameleon. You've got to be able to move and do that, and you've got to do it live. That's it.
But that's a very powerful kind of reframing, I suppose, which is to think of systems change as more like spreading an infection, infiltrating an epidemiological model, if you like.
Yep.
And so then that speaks to alliances and culture being important. And I suppose also the importance of just finding many different reasons why people might work with you, and to see those from many different vantage points. Although I think Alex is absolutely right to remind us that there's a way of scaling which doesn't change anything. It just keeps the system ticking along in a slightly different kind of way. And so I am left with this sort of sense that actually changing systems is really all about building alliances and coalitions across different aspects of the system. I want to go to one last poll that we've got to give the audience one last way to interact. I think we can bring that up. So we're going to go back to the first question we asked, where you were pretty convinced anyway that radical change can happen. We can start the poll now. Do people feel they've got a better idea of what's required for systems innovation? In other words, have Alex and Sophie done a good job? And would you like to learn more about this? So there's obviously a very high number of people who'd like to learn more about it. There's a real appetite for learning and a real interest in doing it. I'm just going to give you 15 seconds to register your vote on that. I think we heard quite a lot from Sophie in answer to the question of how you pitch, and how you pitch is that you find the message that really works for your audience whilst retaining this kind of core to what you're doing. And Alex, perhaps at some point we'll come back to the question of the role of funders. So we're going to close the poll in 5 seconds. We've closed it. Radical change can happen. 84% of people think they've got a better idea of what's required for systems innovation, so that's great. And there's a huge appetite to learn more about it, what it's like to do this from within. So without further ado, I'd like to thank all of our participants for being with us and for adding such incredible insight to our discussions. You can continue the discussion on the Padlet. There's a link to the Padlet in our chat. We will send you an email tomorrow with a link to a recording of this session. We're going to send you Riley's final graphic recording of the session, and we're going to give you a blog where we will sum up many of the questions that have been raised and point you to links. And again, if you haven't seen the longer videos of Sophie and Alex talking, we've got those on our platform, and they're really worth looking into. Tomorrow, at a slightly later time of 4 o'clock Central European time, we've got the amazing Alet Mansky, disability rights campaigner, social activist, entrepreneur, and Diane Roussin, who's one of the leading Indigenous innovators from Canada, talking about culture and systems change. They're going to give 2 remarkable perspectives on that. I look forward to your joining us tomorrow if you can. And to close us off, I'll hand us over to Helena Belila, who is Director of Social Innovation at the Rockwell Foundation. None of this would be possible without the Rockwell Foundation. It's grown out of the Rockwell Foundation, this initiative, and she and the foundation provide an incredible home to this initiative. Helena.
Thank you, Charlie. And let me just, on behalf of the Rockwell Foundation, and I believe also on behalf of all of the listeners we've had out there and the very active participants in the Q&A, it's been absolutely great. And I'd like to thank Sophie and Alex and Ria and Vita for contributing to all of this and giving us lots of new great insights. I think actually, Sophie, you really rounded it off with towards the end when you were saying this is not about duplicating, but it's about infiltrating and infecting. And this is really at the heart of what we are struggling with at the moment. How do we both do systems innovation and reach impact at scale at the same time? And Alex said the magical words when he said, well, you actually have to scale down instead of scaling up. So that's also very important. So thank you all for a wonderful session again today. And I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.